Imagine waking up one morning and being told your ancestors never existed. Not because a war erased them, not because history forgot them, but because a laboratory test said so. Pause. Somewhere between an old black and white photograph and a plastic tube you spit into, 500 years of memory just got questioned. And here's the wild part. This isn't science fiction. This is happening right now. For generations, native identity was carried in stories, in names, in land, in who raised you, who buried you, and who you buried in return. Tribes didn't need permission slips from a lab. Identity wasn't a barcode, it was lived. But today, apparently, 500 years of history can now be verified by saliva. Let that sink in. DNA tests were created to answer biological questions, health risks, ancestry patterns, migration routes, useful tools, powerful tools. But somewhere along the way, we started asking DNA a question it was never designed to answer. Do you belong? Here's the historical tension. Governments want clear categories, science wants measurable data. But indigenous identity has never been neat, clean, or purely genetic. Colonization disrupted bloodlines, forced removals of scattered families. Boarding schools erased records, names were changed, languages were banned, and now, after centuries of disruption, we're shocked when DNA doesn't line up perfectly. That's like burning a library, then blaming the books for being incomplete. And let's be honest, this creates a dangerous moment. When governments lean on DNA, they gain power over recognition. When tribes reject DNA alone, they defend sovereignty. And when individuals are caught in the middle, they're told, "You're not enough of who you say you are." So here's where you come in. Type this in the comments. If DNA says one thing, history says another, and the community says something else, who should have the final word? Because this conversation isn't really about tests. It's about memory. It's about survival. And it's about whether identity is something you inherit or something you're allowed. Stay with me, this story gets deeper. For most of human history, identity was not something you proved. It was something you lived. Long before filing cabinets, birth certificates, and government stamps, native communities already knew who belonged. And no, there wasn't confusion. There wasn't chaos. There wasn't a weekly identity crisis meeting. Identity wasn't locked in paperwork. It was visible in daily life. If you wanted to know who someone was, you didn't ask for documents. You watched them. Who do they eat with? Who do they mourn with? Who do they defend? Who do they answer to? That was the proof. Tribes passed identity through oral history. Stories repeated so often they became memory itself. Names carried meaning. Lineages were spoken, not scanned. Kinship wasn't just blood, it was responsibility. If you helped raise the children, protect the elders, and honor the land, you weren't claiming identity. You were living it. Culture was the receipt. And let's pause for a second, because modern thinking sometimes forgets how recent paperwork actually is. Birth certificates, census rolls, enrollment numbers, those are brand new in human terms. Many were introduced after colonization, often by governments trying to control land, movement, and recognition. So when we talk about proof, we need to ask, proof for whom? Here's the mature humor moment, because history allows it. Your great-grandmother didn't wake up one morning needing a laminated card to confirm who she was. She didn't require a lab result to belong to her people. She knew her name, her role, her songs, and her obligations. That was enough. Now fast forward to today. We're asking descendants of disrupted communities, communities broken by forced removal, record destruction, and assimilation, to present flawless documentation. That's not proof. That's amnesia, dressed up as order. So let's say this clearly. Identity is not paperwork. Paperwork is a tool, sometimes useful, sometimes necessary, but it is not the source. Here's where I want you involved. Drop this in the comments. If identity is lived through responsibility and community, can a document ever fully replace that? Because when we confuse records with reality, We don't just lose history, we misunderstand humanity. And that misunderstanding has consequences. Everything changed the moment the power walked into the conversation. Before colonization, identity flowed through community. After colonization, identity was measured. This wasn't accidental, and it definitely wasn't neutral. As European powers expanded, they didn't just bring weapons and religion. They brought ledgers, clipboards, categories. Suddenly, the native identity wasn't about who lived the culture. It was about who could be counted. That's when ideas like blood quantum appeared. Enrollment numbers followed. Government recognition became the gate. And on the surface, it sounded organized, reasonable, even scientific. But history teaches us to ask why systems are created, not just how they work. Why quantify identity? Because land had to be controlled. Because treaty obligations had to be limited. Because if fewer people qualify on paper, fewer people can claim what was promised. Here's the uncomfortable truth, said calmly, not angrily. The fewer native people there are on paper, the less land has to be honored. That's not identity, that's accounting. Blood quantum reduced living nations into fractions, half this, quarter that, as if culture could be divided like property. Enrollment rolls froze identity in time, even as families grew and histories continued. Government recognition turned living communities into applicants, waiting for approval from the very systems that displaced them. And here's the irony, stick with me. Many native people today are asked to prove purity using standards created by colonizers who never intended those nations to survive indefinitely. That's not preservation, that's slow erasure with paperwork. Now let's add one mature, uncomfortable chuckle, because sometimes history is so absurd you have to laugh to stay sane. Imagine telling a living, breathing community, "Sorry, you still exist, but not enough." So let me bring you into this. Drop this question in the comments. When governments define identity to manage costs and land, does that sound like culture or bookkeeping? Because once power controls identity, identity stops being about belonging and starts being about eligibility. And eligibility, as history shows us, can always be redefined. That's why this moment matters. This isn't just a past problem, it's an ongoing system with real consequences today. Stay with me, we're not done pulling this thread. Let's talk about blood quantum, arguably the most dangerous math problem in history. At its simplest, blood quantum is this: your identity is measured in fractions, 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, not how you live. Not who raised you, not what responsibilities you carry, just a number calculated on paper. Now here's a fact that should stop you for a second. No other ethnic group on earth is measured this way. Not Irish, not Jewish, not Chinese, not African. Only native peoples were turned into fractions by law. And that alone tells you this system wasn't about culture, it was about control. Here's where the logic quietly turns cruel. Blood quantum assumes identity shrinks over time. Every generation, the fraction gets smaller. Which means even if a community survives, practices its culture, speaks its language, and stays connected, on paper, it's slowly disappearing. So yes, this system guarantees something very specific. Native people will eventually vanish in the records, even while they're still very much alive. Now let's sit with the painful humor for a moment, because history sometimes sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud. Imagine being told, "Congratulations, you still live the culture, but according to our math, you expired 3 generations ago." That's not science, that's a countdown clock. And the historical irony? Blood quantum was introduced by governments that disrupted native families through forced removals, intermarriage policies, and assimilation programs. Then later blamed native people for not meeting the purity standards those same systems destroyed. That's like breaking a ruler and then criticizing people for not measuring straight. Here's the key point, slow and clear. Blood quantum doesn't ask, "Who are you?" It asks, "How long until there are fewer of you?" Now I want you in this conversation. Type this in the comments. If a system is designed so people eventually disappear on paper, what was it really built to do? Because when math decides identity, culture becomes temporary. And when culture becomes temporary, history becomes optional. But living nations don't disappear because a fraction says so. They disappear only when the story is forgotten. And that's why this conversation matters. Let's be clear about one thing. DNA is not the enemy. Science is powerful when it's used in the right lane. The problem begins when we ask questions it was never built to answer. Here's the clean distinction. DNA can tell you where your ancestors traveled. It cannot tell you who you belong to. Genetic testing is excellent at tracing migration patterns, how populations moved across continents over thousands of years. It can show shared markers, regional connections, and deep human links that remind us we're more related than we think. That's valuable. That's real science. But DNA does not understand culture. It does not recognize ceremony. It doesn't know languages, responsibilities, or community obligations. A lab can't tell you who raised you, who taught you your stories, or who expects you to show up when something needs to be done. Tribal citizenship has never been a biological club. It's a political, cultural, and social relationship defined by the people themselves. That's why tribes, not companies, decide membership. And that's why no genetic test can hand you belonging in a cardboard box. Here's the smart humor moment, because this line matters. DNA can tell you where your ancestors walked, but not who welcomed them home. That welcome comes from people, not percentages. Historically, this distinction is critical. Native nations existed long before genetics as a field. They governed themselves, recognized kinship, adopted members, and maintained continuity without microscopes or algorithms. Science arrived late to the story, and it doesn't get to rewrite the opening chapters. The danger isn't DNA itself. The danger is context collapse, when a tool designed for research gets used as a judge of identity, when curiosity turns into certification, when ancestry becomes entitlement. Now I want you in this conversation. Drop this in the comments. If DNA gives information but not permission, where should its role begin, and where should it stop? Because when science replaces community, it stops being knowledge and starts becoming authority. And history has shown us what happens when authority forgets the people it's meant to serve. Stay with me. The final layer of this conversation brings everything together. Up to this point, we've talked about systems, policies, numbers, tests. But now we have to talk about people. Because behind every rule is real life waiting on the other side of a decision. Across native communities, there are individuals who have been denied tribal enrollment, not because they rejected the culture, but because the paperwork didn't add up the right way. People who grew up in the community, learned the language, served the elders, and still heard the words, "You don't qualify." That decision doesn't stay on paper. Enrollment often determines access to healthcare, education support, housing programs, and legal protections. When enrollment is denied, care can be delayed. Support disappears. And the cost isn't theoretical. It's physical, emotional, and generational. There are families who have faced something even heavier: burial rights. Imagine being told you can't bury your own relative in ancestral land because a document says you're not officially connected enough. History doesn't prepare you for that moment. It just breaks you quietly. Cultural participation is also affected. Ceremonies, councils, decision-making spaces, these are not performances. They are responsibilities. And when someone is excluded, it's not just identity that's questioned, it's purpose. Now here's the part that doesn't get discussed enough. Paperwork splits families. Siblings can fall on opposite sides of enrollment rules. Cousins raised together can be separated by fractions. One counts, the other doesn't. And that division doesn't come from tradition, it comes from policy. Let me say this line slowly, because it matters. Some people don't lose their identity. They have it taken from them. This isn't about blame, it's about awareness. So here's where you come in. Type this in the comments. If identity is lived in a community, what happens when a system removes someone from that life? Because history isn't just what happened long ago. It's what's still happening quietly right now. And if we don't look at the human cost, we'll keep mistaking rules for justice. Today, native identity isn't just a historical debate. It's a living negotiation. Modern tribes are caught in a space they never designed, standing between sovereignty and survival, while navigating colonial systems they did not create but are still forced to operate inside. On one hand, tribes are sovereign nations. They have the right to decide who belongs. That authority is fundamental. Without it, self-governance collapses. On the other hand, tribes also face real pressures: funding limits, federal recognition rules, legal constraints, and programs tied to enrollment numbers. That tension creates impossible choices. Every enrollment decision now carries weight far beyond culture. It affects resources, healthcare budgets, education funding, housing, political recognition. And when systems reward smaller numbers, tribes are quietly pushed into choices that fracture communities, even when no one wants that outcome. This is where internal conflict begins. Some community members argue for stricter standards to protect resources. Others argue that identity can't survive if it's narrowed into extinction. These debates aren't about ego, they're about fear. Fear of losing land, losing support, losing voice, or losing each other. And here's the part that outsiders often miss. When native communities argue about identity, it's not chaos, it's survival thinking out loud. Now let's bring in a gentle moment of humor, because even heavy truth needs breath. Imagine being told you're fully responsible for protecting your nation, but only using rules someone else wrote. That's not freedom. That's inheritance with conditions. Historically, this is nothing new. Colonized peoples across the world have had to govern themselves using frameworks designed to limit them. The modern identity battle is just the latest chapter of that long story. So let me ask you, and don't rush this one, drop it in the comments. If a tribe decides who belongs, should outside systems overrule them? Because once external authorities override community decisions, sovereignty becomes symbolic. And when sovereignty becomes symbolic, identity becomes fragile. This moment matters, not because it's loud, but because it's ongoing. And how it's resolved will shape the future more than any DNA test ever could. As we end, let's slow everything down. Because after all the arguments, the data, the documents, and the debates, one truth keeps showing up: quiet, steady, unmovable. Identity isn't proven in a lab, it's carried. It's carried in language passed from mouth to ear, in memory passed from generation to generation, in responsibility, the kind you don't claim but answer to. Historically, people knew who they were long before science could name a gene, long before governments created categories, long before paperwork tried to freeze living cultures into fixed boxes. Identity survived migrations, wars, removals, and erasure attempts, not because it was certified, but because it was remembered. That doesn't mean science has no place. It does. DNA can help us understand where we come from. Records can help preserve history. But none of those things can replace what only humans can give each other: recognition, belonging, and accountability. There's a reason elders matter in every culture. They don't hand you test results, they hand you stories. And those stories come with expectations: to care, to protect, to carry forward what you inherited. Here's a gentle moment of humor, because even in seriousness, humanity shows up. No lab has ever taught someone how to grieve properly. No certificate has ever told someone when to show up for their people. Those lessons are learned in kitchens, ceremonies, gatherings, and quiet moments that never make it into databases. That's why this conversation matters. Beyond native identity, beyond this moment. When societies confuse measurement with meaning, we lose something essential. So let me leave you with this, not as an answer, but as an invitation. What do you think defines identity? Blood, culture, or community? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Speak honestly. Listen generously. Disagree respectfully. Because identity isn't something we finish arguing about. It's something we live with together. And if we can talk about it with care, maybe we can carry it forward with wisdom.